Good evening, Ohenia. How are you?
Good evening, Grace. I'm good. And yourself?
Yeah, not too bad. Who and what are we discussing on this week's episode?
The case that we are going to be unraveling today was one of the most deadliest mass shooting in New Zealand. We are talking about the Aramoana Massacre, perpetrated by David Gray on the 13th of November of 1990. First, I would like to acknowledge our sources for this investigation. Tragedy at Aramoana, a book that was written by Paul Benseman, a journalist that covered in real life the events, and Aramoana, 22 Hours of Terror, written by Bill O'Brien, who was also a witness, a first-person witness since he was a policeman. And also the documentary What Makes a Mass Murder, which we found on YouTube and was very enlightening about some aspects of the psychology of the killer.
But also we did manage to track down the movie Out of the Blue, which was directed by Robert Sarkis and stars the wonderful Carl Urban, which was a fair timeline of the event. A lighter, less documentative insight into the event. I definitely recommend Out of the Blue.
Which was based on the Bill Brosnan book, so it's actually quite accurate. There is little dramatization or just enough to let us know some basics about David Gray and what happened on those 22 hours of terror. David Malcom Gray was born in Port Chalmers, New Zealand, on November the 20th of 1956. He was the third and the youngest child of David and Molly Gray. His father, David Sr., served in the army in several countries during World War II. Molly, also known as Mary, worked as a machinist at the G.H. Ferguson shirt factory in Port Chalmers. She was a popular front figure in society, while David Gray Sr., like his youngest son, was more of a quiet, introverted figure. They were working class, and like many New Zealanders in the late 1950s, the family could barely afford to own a car. About David's childhood, he was regarded by most of the people as a normal child. Some felt like he was a bit of a sensitive, perhaps a bit vulnerable. When he was on primary school, he had to use a pair of very thick glasses that earned him a bit of mockery, but there are not accounts that it was really a very severe case. Remember what their cousins, David Gray's cousins, would say, that he was a bit of a prankster? He would like to... What did he like to do?
Well, he would set up tripwires that would set off crackers, basically. So people would, walk through the kitchen and trip the tripwire, which would then release a mechanism which would set off a loud, small cracker, small explosion, and, scare the bejesus out of whoever it was.
His mother.
His mother most of the time.
Most of the time it was his mother, but this wasn't really much more like maybe a child's mischief. He liked to sneak around a little bit.
Yeah.
He had an interest on weaponry and warfare in general.
But, you can understand with his father being a veteran of several conflicts that he would have been... Well, from all accounts, his father was quite well respected in the community, and if he wanted to emulate his father, looking up to him, then you can understand how he could idolize that aspect. Yeah,
there is no indication of the parents or any in the family being maybe abusive towards him, which is something that you see in other killers, but not in David. Some people... Some friends or some relatives would say that they felt like he was a bit spoiled.
Yeah, a bit coddled by his mother, a bit, wrapped in cotton wool.
Also because he was a bit sensitive. But after leaving school, he began a federated farmers cadetship, but did not finish. And on December of 1974, David Gray's parents took him to a Port Chalmers doctor who referred the then 18-year-old David to a psychiatrist at the Dunedin hospital, and they were worried about him. There was never a diagnosis for him, but for what acquaintances said, it seems like he started to be particularly... He was always quiet, but got like more introverted, spending more time in his room, reading, just showing general...
Antisocial.
Not antisocial, but more unsocial. It's just... I wondered if maybe he had... the beginning of a depression, because he seemed to be uninterested by anything.
Yeah.
Like, didn't have like initiative to
to go out and socialize.
Go on and socialize.
Join a sports team, or all the things young people even today are sort of, to a degree, expected to do. Not so much, I guess, but I think back then especially, everyone, a lot of the community would either join a local cricket team or a local rugby team, or, even, go out hunting, which is very, very popular in New Zealand.
Exactly.
So he never really joined any of the social activities that a lot of people would expect.
His job as a trainee farm worker was not succeeding. His bosses would complain that David Gray kept his room and his own appearance and interest and anxiety, and was also a chain smoker. And now I'm quoting from Tragedy at Aramoana. The psychiatrist's notes say that David Gray had trouble blending into the three farming families he had worked with. He was also experiencing difficulty with his cadetship correspondences courses and in sleeping and eating. He suffered from loss of appetite, fatigue, and apathy. In between 1979 and 1983, David Gray worked at the railways department at Dunedin, and he struck upon one very meaningful friendship that was with Paul Mer. David had a great sense of humor. It was a bizarre, witty Monty Python type of humor. David was kind of known for being a prankster and being a bit of a joker with his other workmates, but they would also tell that sometimes he would have little quarrels or arm blasting matches, and sometimes he would take jokes a bit to the heart. He was told that he couldn't take a joke, even though he had quite a good humor, but he would always had small fits of rage, but late afterwards he would apologize. Yeah. And he was in particular sensitive about the fact that he was becoming bald at a very early age.
Yeah. Which led to one of his fairly well-known, I guess, trademarks or hallmarks of him always coming to wear a beanie.
A balaclava.
A black balaclava. Was it black or khaki?
I think it was black.
Black.
But it would look like a beanie because he would roll it up his head.
Yep, so he'd roll it up, and it was always,
Paul Mer would say that it was some sort of protective item that he couldn't let go.
But I think he was just a very sensitive young man, but also needed that shell of bravado that he wouldn't take a joke. Yeah. And, that was probably a defense mechanism to, even though he was cold and sensitive, he didn't want to have that sensitive side exposed or hurt or damaged, and to the point where he would apologize for it afterwards after lashing out.
But there was something else. What was his other... He had a passion for a certain type of literature.
Again, which really builds on his long-term interest, is his love of military and military history. He collected numerous second-hand books on, what started focusing on World War II, and in particular the German army and the rise of the Nazi Party and its effects on the population of Germany.
This is an aspect that is very interesting about him, because on one hand, Paul Mer would say that Gray would also be very interested in also living in the wildlife, like being a bit of a survivalist. He was interested in that sort of literature, and he talked with admiration about the Viet Cong. It was one day that Paul and his wife Lois met, spent a weekend at Davis Gray at his Aramoana crib, that I feel Paul really got a feeling of how cynical and how dark his David Gray's feelings towards society were becoming. Paul would say that first off, it was the crib, living in the crib was extremely depressing. There is footage of how it looked before or after the massacre, to be precise, and it was extremely unkept. Well, David himself was very unkept. He was extremely skinny. He didn't seem to eat a lot. And Paul would say that even though David invited him and his friend's wife to spend the night, the only dinner he could offer to them was a bunch of potatoes he toasted to the fire and cooked.
So he was he was living a very reclusive,
scarce,
pulled. What am I trying to say?
It's clear he wasn't wealthy, but it really seemed like he was living under his own means. He would also use mostly thrift shop clothes that look military or that they were military.
Yeah.
I keep interpreting this lack of keeping himself, and this even the lack of appetite as well. It actually is a depression.
Yeah, absolute. Also, I think his romanticization of his austerity, which factored into the way his crib was kept, and also the way he lived, was a certain grim outlook and pride at the fact that he could, quote unquote, live off nothing and survive off of, his wits and the surrounding, environment when he would, catch fish or, any rabbits or anything he could do to live off the local environment. When many other people in similar situations were doing it tough, as they say, but at the same time were eking out a decent quality of life and still, surviving on as much as he was on unemployment benefits. He definitely wasn't the only one. And while it is close to the margins, it's still perfectly able to live a good life off of that.
Yeah, he started picking the unemployment once he was after he was, I think he was actually fired from the railroad on 1983. So until 1919, which is the year of the massacre, he had been living 7 years on unemployment, basically. And one from Bill Brosnan's book, Aramoana, the Mets stayed for 2 nights with Gray, but found his lifestyle too basic. The crib was Spartan, food was scarce, and the couple found it uncomfortable and not as tidy and clean as they would want. The experience was rather unpleasant, and Gray's cynicism and bitterness towards society were too much to take. He believed that other races were going to take the country over, an Asian invasion. He believed it was inevitable and was scared of losing what he had. But also thank you of having a kind of scarce way of life. In 1982, David managed to do a bit of a tour. He went on a 3-month trip, basically going around the different countries in which his father had served. He left New Zealand in early January 1982. He arrived in Tokyo on the 10th of January. And after a week touring Japan, he flew into London's airport. He visited Holland, France, went through the Alps between France and Italy into Germany, and then spent a week in Greece, followed by almost a month in Spain, Egypt, and Morocco before returning through France and Holland to England. And afterwards he came back. He had a rough time being a backpacker, so to speak. What were his issues?
What were his issues?
It's never too clear. There is an incident in which he was given a full body search by the police in Germany.
That's right, and he felt, well, obviously the extreme discomfort of being physically searched, but also I think for him it was the indignity a white man, basically, a white New Zealand man would be subjected to a search of that nature when, he obviously never considered himself part of a minority or a section of society that would be worthy of, or not worthy, would be subjected to a full body search. And so the indignity and the offence that caused him obviously, really affected him, and I think definitely stayed with him and added to the weight that, added to the list of trauma. I don't know if that's the right word, but...
And he had he was having a hard time hanging around strangers because he went by himself and he would stay at hotels. He was regarded also as having a very conservative... Well, we already insinuated that he is racist. Well, we always said that he is racist for the Asian invasion trope, which is one of the favorite tropes of the far right, the demonizing of foreigners by white people, basically. While on his trip through Europe in 1982, David Gray also sent a postcard to Paul and Lois Met, his friends, and told him that he had been locked up in a train station at night in Paris by the police, so had a few misadventures. So before returning to Paul Chalmers after doing his 3-month trip, Gray tried living in the North Island, and he spent 6 months in Wellington and 2 months of the summer of 1982 in Auckland. From Paul Bensman's book, a Wellington flatmate of Gray's said Gray seemed quite confused at times and lived in a fantasy world. He actually spoke about having served time for going on a rampage with a gun in Dunedin. He eventually told me it was untrue. This is the flatmate. He once sat in the living room and pointed his loaded rifle at my head and said, "I could kill you now and nothing would happen," the flatmate recalled. Gray also claimed to be a burglar and said he dreamed of being a mercenary. In spite of the fantasies, Gray seemed a relatively ordinary person, the flatmate said, with a sense of humor. But he was unusually sensitive and was easily hurt. He would react badly if criticized. He once punched a guest in the Wellington flat when the visitor produced some cannabis. I feel he was trying to compensate this sensitiveness by these fantasies of being a mercenary or some sort of warrior.
Yeah, a very hyper-masculine, hyper-macho persona.
Yeah.
To, act as like I said, a shell of bravado that, would hopefully leave his soft, sensitive side unavailable for, people to pick on. But also his sense of social right and righteousness, I guess you could say, in attacking a person who pulled out a joint, which is not uncommon in New Zealand. And from what I understand, there's always been a fairly relaxed attitude towards smoking marijuana in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And
he wasn't having it.
No, he saw it as very, obviously unfit and improper, to the point where he attacked his housemate's friend. And I think that, that sort of also feeds back into the, I guess, slightly conservative, but, mindset of him being strip searched in Germany, and he was a right and proper white middle class Commonwealth citizen who shouldn't have to undergo these
being treated as a criminal.
Yeah, undergo these indignities. As that's why his dad fought in the war to protect that way of life, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so I felt that probably he had a bit of an entitlement, deserved to be treated differently, in which case, and speaking of the father, because it's a very important piece in the puzzle of this crime, I don't think it's really so mysterious.
Well, I mean, he definitely revered his parents. I mean, his father was, a war veteran, which was important to David Gray. And, later on, he lost his mother, which, according to his sister, was absolutely devastating because she, according to reports, she was very strong and, loving, but she was a very strong and caring woman who David, she protected David, and David absolutely, adored her, and as his sister said, it really, really affected him, and really, even though he was already depressed and withdrawing from society, this really pushed him even further in that direction.
Yes. So David Gray Sr. died on 1978, and his mother in 1985, and it was devastating because it was really quick. Initially, she had been having some memory issues, being a bit, confused. Like, at the beginning, the doctors had said that she had Alzheimer's. Within a couple of months, she was being nursed by David and one of her sisters, that is Aunt Jean. But after several months, she was admitted at the Wakari hospital, in which doctors communicated to the family that she had actually brain tumor and would soon die. On January 1985 is when Molly died. This is the most important turning point into the life of David, whom at this point was already unemployed. Yeah, I feel that they were supportive, but I think he never grieved properly in a healthy manner. He was also kind of...
Depending on which source you go with, it does sound like he was, okay with children. He definitely never injured or molested any children. But it's also noted that he was very kind and fond of animals. So as a, on the McDonald triad of serial killers and people who commit heinous crimes against other humans, he, that's one of the big warning factors, and he clearly doesn't go towards that aspect.
Having lost his parents, being unemployed, and there are no recollections of him trying to find a way to support himself, he had no option but to move into the small crib in Aramoana, which he would rename
Hildskaf,
the high seat in the palace of Odin, the legendary Norse god of war. That's how he called his crib, and one of his neighbors, Garry Holden, she was intrigued by the new name, and she would after said that she would ask David what it meant. He answered, "You'll find out one day." When he was moving out to Aramoana after the death of Molly, he had an incident that was never reported, in which David Gray suddenly produced a flick knife and threatened to stab his older brother. "He could have easily stabbed me, but he didn't. I got the knife out of him, but was surprised of how strong he was." This apparently completely uncalled attack went under the radar for whatever reason. Well, because it was his brother.
It was his brother, and
they were probably trying to protect him. The death of his mother and him moving to Aramoana is a tipping point. But he had some friends. He had a friend, Nicky Boone, with whom they would spend many hours at night discussing about, you know what? Occultism. But anyhow, Nicky Boone would hang around with him, but for personal reasons, she wasn't interested in having anything with him. She would say in Aramoana, Bill O'Brien's book, that she was actually coming out of relationship, and she made it clear to David that it wasn't personal, but she was happy to be friends, and he didn't seem to be very affected, but he made an offhand comment about just another rejection. Bill Brosnan, the owner of Galaxy Books, would also say that David, he wasn't interested in having a partner, but mainly because he didn't like what Bill calls modern women, quote unquote, that David felt like modern women were too aggressive or independent.
He wanted the old-fashioned housewife, which again, as you know, we're seeing now with a lot of, I guess you could say, the incel culture is a common trait of entitlement. Young men who see themselves as upstanding citizens who have trouble dating and finding love, believe it's their right to have a woman, nurture them and give them affection, as well as keeping their house and probably raising children eventually. But they feel that they're entitled and owed this somehow.
Like it's a natural order.
Yeah.
Which is basic misogyny.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Very brutal misogyny.
And
to believe that there are gender roles, such as being a housewife or even being a strong man.
Exactly. And, that sort of conservative mentality leads to blaming the rise of feminism and, the whole idea of the modern woman being uppity and too picky for men who just want a quote unquote traditional relationship.
One of his close friends or acquaintance was actually one of his family members, Jim Granger, whom David would call a crowbar, because he always kept a crowbar on the side of his car and would constantly make a joke about bashing David in the head with the crowbar, which they found hilarious. What I'm interested is in this letter that it's on Bill O'Brien book. That is a letter sent by David Gray to Jim the 21st of April of 1987. What I'm really interested is on what David Gray wrote on the back of the envelope as his return address.
Sender, Rudolf Hess. Care of, Maximum Security Bunker, B12, Berlin.
Rhetorical question. Whom is this Rudolf Hess that David seemed to be identifying in some way or trying to make a joke with this persona?
Well, one of the highest ranking Nazi military officers during World War II and a close associate of Adolf Hitler himself.
I really wonder what his family thought of this. I wonder if they innocently ignore whom Rudolf Hess was, which would be very curious since, New Zealand actually took part in Second World War, or if he thought it was some sort of dark humor. There is, or I believe, that you can do that a lot of legit social criticism with humor and irony and satire especially, but there is always someone whom tries to masquerade their hatred or their bigotry as quote-unquote humor. I wonder if this was the case with David Gray.
Yeah. But, I mean, by that stage, I think maybe his family and a lot of family friends may have, I hate to use the term, written him off as just being really, really weird.
As his eccentricities.
Yes. Yeah, which is a polite way of saying it. Yeah. the fact that he lived, his bunker, so to speak, his crib was the family holiday home. So I think they were happy to have him safe.
I think the loneliness that he imposed into himself and being unemployed and probably being depressed and untreated just make him more and more isolated within the years, but got more and more
into the culture of the far right, and which I think leads a lot of young men who feel isolated and want that, want to be the hero in their own life story, and part of that is to be a great warrior, and that leads to an interest in military and military culture, mercenary culture, soldiering culture, and unfortunately, that a lot of the time that leads to some pretty extreme ideologies, and it appears in this case is what happened with David.
Quoting from Strategy at Aramoana, he was especially interested in thriller paperbacks, travel books, self-sufficiency manuals, whole earth catalogs, war stories, military magazines such as Soldier of Fortune. One writer that he enjoyed was Ayn Rand, who wrote Attles, Shrug, and other titles on right-wing capitalism. In his last year, he ordered and imported some very antisocial books from the United States, such as The Anarchist Arsenal by David Harbour, about improvised bombs and incendiary devices, Life After Doomsday by Bruce Clayton, on how to survive post-nuclear war anarchy, including How to Fight Off Neighbours, and The Poor Man's James Bond by Kurt Saxon, about methods of harassing, injuring, or killing opponents. Some sources said that he was a pen friend of this guy, Kurt Saxon, but it wasn't really like that. He wrote a fan letter in which he would praise this author and he would regard it as a very brave and intellectual man that was saying
truths uncomfortable truths. Yeah.
Classic. Classic defense mechanism of people that are into the far right and are just creating content that is hateful, and they try to defend themselves by saying that they are just brave and they are just being censored. So if we look at Kurt Saxon in internet, the first definition is in Wikipedia. Kurt Saxon is an American neo-Nazi writer and radio host, survivalist, and the author of Poor Man James Bond, a series of books on improvised weapons and ammunition. What about the Soldier of Fortune?
Well, Soldier of Fortune magazine, which had been going since the mid-70s, was effectively an adult version of Boys' Own Adventures, where these reporters would write stories on major conflicts that were occurring and minor conflicts, or soldiers and mercenaries themselves would send in letters documenting their daily life and some of the missions that they had, and these were published as sort of like an adventure journal. But also it served as a bulletin board, I guess you could say, of mercenary companies that were recruiting armed forces that were recruiting as well, and were more than happy to take in foreign-trained or vaguely trained enthusiastic people.
They even have a webpage nowadays. Yeah. Had some articles about justifying the intervention of United States in several Latin American countries as, the quote-unquote war on communism or war on drugs. I don't know what it says about the current invasion of Ukraine, but I have a feeling this might be a pro-Russian or a pro-imperialist point of view. As 1919 moved on, Gray continued his path toward destruction. His reading material was now bizarre. Titles taken from the library in the last few months included Killer, Military Small Arms of the War, The Dispossessed Majority, interesting title, the SKS Assault Rifle, Home Gunsmithing, Fighters, Modern Fighters, and Attack Craft. He was impressed by the writings of Kurt Saxon and wrote to him saying, "I have decided to risk more money on your publications, which I enjoy." And then went on to say what he thought of the poor man's James Bond. Quote, "Your writing caused much provoking thought," wrote David Gray. "Somewhat a rarity in this day and age, and you actually appeared on my television screen in a documentary on survival."
David Gray's closest neighbour, or next door neighbour, was a man named Garry Holden.
Garry Holden.
Yes.
Whom had 2 daughters, Chiquita and Jasmine, whom he had with Julie Holden, the neighbour that we mentioned before. Garry was very well appreciated in the community. He had been for many years with his partner, Julie Holden, until he struck a friendship that later on ended up being a romantic relationship with another neighbor of Aramoana, Julianne Bryson, who had an adopted daughter, Reba. They were really close, close at some extent with David Gray. He got along with the children at some point before the last years.
Yep.
And David was also known for having a metal detector. He would use on the beaches of Aramoana and would very frequently help children or other neighbors
Locate lost
objects. I mean, just to state that he wasn't a complete outcast.
No.
When he moved on.
Yeah. And wasn't a complete shut-in.
And he wasn't completely rejected by everybody. But Garry was into more naturist medicine, and Julianne Bryson was the leader of the Spiritist Society of Dunedin, actually, which is kind of funny. First off, it seemed like David was very upset that Garry had split with his partner and moving with another woman and again, I think this is a sign of his conservative mindset. The tipping point of their relationship, or at least for Gray, was an argument about a dog, Kento, who was Holden's Alsatian German Shepherd. What are the odds? Whom David Gray was particularly attached to, and would with the permission of Garry Holden, he would take the dog for hours on walks for the beach. But what happened with poor Kento?
One of the issues that, one of the major issues was that Kento would run off and chase sheep and attack them, which, in a particularly rural setting and one that has a very high population of sheep farmers, that was a major problem. So unfortunately, Garry had to put Kento down.
And David took it. Oh, he was blaming Garry.
For not disciplining and training Kento.
Training the animal. Yeah, exactly. And it was also said that Garry had a hutch of rabbits that he didn't take care of them for whatever reason. And on one occasion, David set them free. People regarded Garry as a good man, a bit of a macho.
Yeah.
Like he would scream friendly abuse to other people, or was a bit of a joker himself. He turned into more naturist medicine when he started having the symptoms of chronic fatigue, also known as Tapa Nui flu. It's like a post-viral disease. You know whom else thought that had Tapa Nui flu?
Who is that?
His neighbor, David Gray.
David Gray.
And at some extent, David told some acquaintance that he suspected Garry of giving him the Tapa Nui flu, which I think is not really contagious. That is not something that happens. On one occasion, David had to be saved by his neighbors because he was burning some trash in the backyard, and he fell asleep to have a nap, but then he wasn't physically capable of getting up because of his fatigue, and he had to be rescued I think this is, again, maybe his depression symptoms, that he wouldn't admit to be suffering, and he put the blame on his neighbor, Garry.
Yeah. And there was one of the final, I guess, straws which really pushed Gray over the line and particularly isolated him from the community.
Because he already had ideas of people not liking him or people being behind him. Almost every one of his acquaintances, Jim, Bill Brosnan, Paul Mead, and family members would say that he was growing paranoid. He seemed to have some ideations of people talking behind his back. And at some point he almost... there are many... Yeah, you can go say the one that you're saying, because that is very key. In
the community, there was a incident where some women's underwear, some knickers, were stolen off of a washing line. And there was absolutely no...
There were also sightings of a peeping Tom doing its...
just a shadowy figure sneaking around. Absolutely no way provable, or no evidence was provided that it actually was David. But
one of the neighbors, a woman and her teenager daughter, who said that they saw a man, medium-sized man, wearing a beanie, tipping on the windowsills, and that they got to see him, but couldn't recognize any features aside from this beanie or hat, or you could say that rolled up balaclava, such as
David
was very attached to. And this is interesting because this neighbor, this woman, she never accused David. She only said what he had seen.
Because the locals formed essentially a lynch mob and burst into Gray's flat, his cabin, and
roughed him up,
tuned him up a bit. And
there are no details of what rough him up was. And this mob, compounded by men, also look around his crib and trying to find the missing knickers, the missing panties, but none were found. If he had some feeling about being paranoid, and he was right to be paranoid at some extent, because he, I had to make him responsible of this. He wasn't even trying to be friendly or trying to connect with anybody else. But there was really, I couldn't find any detail of the investigation that it was done on the peeping Tom. But Stuart Guthrie, an officer that
was later in the
event of the massacre, was actually the one that went and interviewed David and did his own legitimized search for evidence. And there is not full disclosure of the investigation, but there are no mentions of any fingerprints or DNA or any of the scientific procedure of the investigation, and there were no other suspects. And no one else was interviewed as a suspect about this peeping Tom incident, so there really wasn't any physical evidence to point David out. I really believe people only thought that he was a peeping Tom because he was a weirdo and an outcast. And the neighbor that saw the man, whoever it was,
in no way identified,
and she actually went up to the crib to apologize after she knew that he had been bullied by the other men, because she never intended that to happen. Not even she believed that it was David, and I don't think there
certainly was no hard proof that it was a. And there was nothing in his background either that would suggest he'd do that.
People are more likely willing to believe a witness recollection of a sexual abuse or some sort of deviant behavior as this, when the accused is what you will call an weirdo or an unhinged person. And in reality, you don't have to be a weirdo to be a rapist. No, what I'm trying to say is now when a person that is well recognized or has a good reputation among a community, then all of a sudden people are less likely to believe the rape victims and the rape accusations. So just a very stereotypied idea of how a rapist or a pervert looks. It's like always looking for the weirdo or the antisocial, and sometimes the perverts are antisocials and weirdos in the more stereotypical way. Like a man with a greasy trench coat.
Trench coat, yep.
And sometimes the pervert are merry, church-going men that have a secret life. As many of the most infamous serial killers were
the last ones you think of.
White middle-class men that have children and everybody liked.
Yep.
So, I don't feel it was fair to him.
No.
And if he was already being a paranoid, this really gave him one certainty that many people were willing to believe he was a weirdo and a creep. So going to the events of...
Okay, in one of the other later events that occurred in 1990 in January was at Galaxy Books. David actually threatened one of the assistants who worked there by presenting a cardboard box, which he intimated had some sort of long barrel gun, and threatened the assistant.
Yeah, he had some personal grievances with this Kevin Fletcher was his name, the assistant. Bill Brosnan was David Gray's friend.
Yep.
This Kevin actually would admit to pick on David a little bit, maybe call him names, and he had enough on that January. And basically, he didn't pull the gun. He would always carry around the gun, but he put the gun in the cardboard on the front desk, and actually not very politely invited the assistant to figure out her chances with a fist fight, which never happened. Constable Peter Murray went to David Gray's crib on that occasion because they called the police on him. Bill did it, and really kind of feels like Bill did it on David's best interest, but Constable Peter Murray didn't find any fire gun, which is very notable since we will know that David spent many years making his own arsenal for a fact.
Yes.
And on an occasion also Bill Brosnan saw David walking around Dunedin and thought about making a practical joke on him. So you remember in the documentary that he went on the back of David and told him, hold there, or stop it, or whatever. Just doing a practical joke. And without hesitation, David turned around very slowly and threw a punch at him. Maybe even realizing that he was his friend or completely careless. Bill would say that he got into fighter mode. David also had a very bad eyesight. Yes. He had glasses, and it looks like his eyesight was bad enough to be able to have a benefit. Was basically legally
almost blind, but refused to have it. Refused to wear the glasses because he felt that they weren't macho enough.
That would be the word.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, he, like you said, his eyesight was bad enough that he was able to collect social security, welfare, like on medical grounds.
I mean, aside from the unemployment, but maybe his pride prevented him to do it, so he had a chance of improving his situation at some extent. Paul would also say that he was trying to encourage him to get therapy, but of course David had to pay for that, and I am sure it wasn't economic at all for him, but I feel like he had asked for help, would have gotten from somebody.
Yeah. I mean, even, I think during the 80s there wasn't, it was, mental health was still, kind of a taboo subject, but there definitely were outlets where you could seek help if you really felt that you needed it.
Bill Brosnan also was trying to discourage him to buy the Soldier of Fortune magazine on the last year of his life. So we got someone else realized something was not quite all right with David. David had, as usual, another argument with Garry Holden a few days before the Aramoana massacre because, Gray was, even though he was regarded to be an animal lover, on the last years of his life he turned even hostile against animals, throwing rocks at neighbor's dog, and he even killed his pet budgie, Condor, whom he had trained to do tricks. He trained him to attack, quote-unquote. Because David would say that the bird got on his nerves. And a few days before, had an argument with Holden, and Garry Holden sent I think it was Chiquita, with some meal to David, because he always looked malnourished, and he yelled at the child, tell her to go away, he didn't want anything, and shut the door, perhaps suffering from hallucinations or delusions of some type aside from paranoia, but
it's hard to say because
there's
no diagnosis. There's no.
On the morning of November 13 of 1990, the day of the tragedy of Aramoana, Bert Gibbs, one of Aramoana residents, saw David around 7 a.m. Bert was driving his utility truck to Paul Sherman's, and Gray was cycling. He had a bike. He had inherited a car from his family, but suffered an accident, and he never had the money to fix it, so it was just left to rotten. And Bert Grease offered him a ride on his truck, and David would say, "No, it's a beautiful morning. I would love a good ride. I'll just ride." So, do you know what he was doing at Dunedin that day?
Yes, that's right. That morning of the massacre, David had made a trip into Dunedin to bank a cheque at his local at the local branch of the bank he'd always been with, and his family had always been with, and they had just started instituting a processing fee for cheques, a $2 processing fee, which David took umbrage to, which led to a fairly loud outburst, to which he grabbed his cheque and stormed out.
I guess the amount of money really didn't matter to him.
It was just the fact that he'd been loyal to an institution.
And felt like he was entitled to some special treatment.
Yep. Yeah, that perhaps was the straw that broke the camel's back. We'll never know, but...
No one will never know, but he was visually upset, and he was trying to get that check to actually buy more ammunition. He had been communicating to several... suppliers, one in Auckland, and writing several very unhinged letters. Another common trope that we can see in several mass murders and far-right ideologists, and that David Gray shares, was his love for guns and his hatred for state-enforced laws that control the acquisition
of certain types of guns. At the time of the massacre, there was an Arms Act that had been instituted in 1983, which had introduced the concept of lifetime firearms licenses, where conditions for holding a license were that you be over the age of 16 and considered and vetted lightly, and to be considered a fit and proper person to own firearms. Once you had that license, there was absolutely no requirement to register any of the weapons that you that the license holder would own, and you could have as many of them as you wish, and there was no limit to the amount of ammunition you could stockpile either. There were certain restrictions on heavier weapons and pistols, but you could acquire a special license, endorsement, and an acquisition permit. So at the time, it was the actual ownership of individual weapons was completely unregulated, and to this day, because no records were ever kept, it's quite difficult to pin down the number of firearms that are actually in circulation in New Zealand, which would cause a problem all through New Zealand's the years after the massacre, where they conducted a investigation into the amending of the Firearms Act, and it was found that semi-automatic weapons of a military style, which the public was most concerned about, and clamping down and registering weapons, was largely left untouched due to pressure and lobbying from the gun industry and sports shooters associations. Mm-hmm. So effectively, none of the requirements, none of the amendments to the bill actually were ever passed, which included the amount of ammunition that one could own and the type of ammunition owned and the type of weapons owned, whether it was semi-automatic military-style weapons or others. And also the main reason given why a total ban on these on types of semi-automatic military-style weapons was that the compensation to enable a buyback scheme was going to be too expensive for the government, on top of the opposition from the gun rights groups. New laws that were enacted, though, were that you would require a firearms license to actually purchase ammunition, and that a lifetime license could be revoked if someone had committed a serious offence, and that the lifetime licenses were reduced from a lifetime to 10 years, where you'd have to go and get reassessed. Also, a stricter clamp on mail orders, mail ordering weapons and ammunition was enacted, and also the requirement for stricter storage of weapons and ammunition. Yeah, it's said that around 1992, even after this initial Amendment Act, that only 4% of firearms in New Zealand were registered. So that's a lot of firearms that are completely unknown and off the scope enforcement agents.
David wasn't having any of those restrictions.
No.
For sure. In his last years, he was also trying to make a living out of being a freelance writer, since all the stuff that he was writing were notes and like editorials to, guns and ammunition and survival type of magazines. Mm. He had written an article called Hardline Survival Tactics, and the first very long sentence of this article was, quote, "If you, like many, are becoming concerned with worldwide climate changes, rising crime, inflation, recession, and depression on a worse scale than eventuated in the 1930s, that our parents lived through at such cost, and if you are realistic enough to understand and realize the problems facing us are too big and too expensive for any government to handle, then you must prepare." Aside from the articles he was writing, one of these letters that Gray was intended to send, Soldier of Fortune, or one of his military and weaponry magazine, mentions two mass murders. One is the Hungerford Massacre, a pre-shooting that happened in Hungerford, England, perpetrated by Michael Ryan, and the other one was the Hoddle Street Massacre, whom responsible was Julian Knight, in Australia, in Melbourne. Killers with different motivations. The Hungerford Massacre was a man who had been expelled from his teaching position because he had been sexually abusing children, and after being unemployed for many years, performed a killing spree in a school, to be precise, and also murdered his mother. And Julian Knight was also a far-right enthusiast, if you wish. He shot dead 7 people and injured 19 during his spree. And this is curious because David Gray mentions these 2 killers, but a point that he's trying to make in his letter is that after these different mass shootings, like a consequence of those mass shootings were that in both in England and Australia started to toughen up their laws about gun ownership. David wasn't having that either. So it's how I find it how curious that you take these 2 killers to make your point about people having more guns. David Gray being a mass killer himself is very... I wouldn't say it's even funny. It's... I don't know.
I was also going to say that, in the breakdown of Ryan's life, who was responsible for the Hungerford massacre, it was also noted that he had a very obsessive fascination with firearms and videos and, war culture, and was also obsessed with survival skills, firearms, magazines, and it's noted that he was a fairly avid reader of Soldier of Fortune as well.
Once again, what are the odds?
Yeah.
The day of the Aramoana massacre, a couple of hours before the events begin, David Gray scribbled a very weird, peculiar note that says, editorial. A. The general public is an ass high on drugs, legal antidepressants such as Valium, alcohol, sleeping pills. 100,000 taken per night. Alcoholics, 55,000 in a population of 3.3 million. They have as much right to decide anything as Genghis Khan barbaric hordes did. B. Liberty and freedom cannot be compromised. You either have full democracy or none. There is no repeat, no halfway between them. Only the slow slide to dictatorship.
Well, but that's that very, that's that quite extreme libertarian viewpoint of, I should be able to do what I want whenever I want, and,
almost like a sovereign citizen.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's, the prepper mindset, the survivalist mindset tends to cross over with that sort of libertarian ideals of self-sufficiency, and part of that is owning a lot of guns to protect what's yours.
For invisible enemies or the foreign enemy.
That's it. So, leading up to the massacre, probably over a period of years, he, had gone from boy's own adventure in Soldier of Fortune to past the Ayn Rand stage of libertarianism, and then leading on to the hardcore survivalist stockpiling of weapons to, again, use against. But this is all led up to this one particular day.
On the afternoon, David Gray was already back at Aramoana, and at 7:30 he confronted his neighbour, Garry Holden. The details are unknown of what he was arguing. We do know is that Gray went back into his crib. He retrieved a Norinco semi-automatic rifle, walked outside and shot Holden multiple times in the chest before walking over him and shot him fatally through the head. Nearby, witnessing everything for their disgrace, were Holden's 2 daughters, Chiquita and Jasmine, and his girlfriend Julian Rison's adopted daughter, Riva. The girls promptly ran into Holden's house to hide from Gray as he walked into their property. He found Chiquita and shot her in the chest and the arm, resulting in a bullet lodging into her stomach. Somehow, Chiquita managed to run for her life. Unfortunately, Jasmine and Riva were hiding in the house living room, and they were soon found and shot dead by David Gray. Chiquita fled past her father's body to the Rison's nearby house, which was a couple of blocks away, while Gray set the Holden house on fire. He managed to get to Julian's house while screaming, "David's gone mad. He shot me and he killed Dad." Julianne Bryson took her van and took Chiquita, drove actually to Holden's house.
The house by that stage was already on fire. When she got near it, David started shooting indiscriminately at the car and hit it several times, at which point
Julianne kept driving.
Yep, she kept on driving, and I think, absolutely guttingly must have realised that by that stage
there was nothing she could do.
Yeah, there was nothing she could do, and her daughter and her partner's daughter were more than likely dead, or hopefully by some miracle they were still alive, that they would have legged it and would be hiding in the bush somewhere.
Until modern days, Julianne Bryson feels guilt for not stopping at the house, even though it was set ablaze, and David Gray himself was with a rifle shooting at her, and just by pure chance didn't get shot. But well, they both ran away in the car. At this point, Gray started shooting indiscriminately, targeting a utility vehicle full of locals who had seen the Holden house on fire. Were trying to help. He first shot Vanessa Percy several times in the back as she ran down the street in terror, whom unfortunately passed away a few hours later in the scene. David then turned towards 3 children, shot dead, 2 of them, Leo Wilson and Dion Percy, whom were hiding in the back of the truck and were the boys that Chiquita had seen before.
Earlier.
The boy's sister, Stacy, was critically injured, and she stayed frozen in terror with siblings until the police could reach them. Ross Percy, the children's father, was as well fatally shot in the head. The next one, Aleki Talley, was another neighbor. Aleki Talley was also shot dead. Gray then entered the home of Tim Jamison, an old man who had an issue with drinking, was regarded as a good man as long as he was sober, but when he wasn't sober he would scream abuse at basically everybody, and well, Gray wasn't an exception, but yet he was shot dead. The next victim was Jane Dixon, who was looking for his dog. Eva Helen Dixon, James' mother, and his neighbor Chris Cole went into the road to see what the commotion was. Gray shot both of them, wounding Cole, who was in a phone booth calling the police, and forcing Mrs. Dixon to die for a cover. Mrs. Dixon, who had recently had a hip replacement and was unable to walk without assistance, pulled herself along on her stomach and fell into a ditch to get inside and call 111, the emergency phone number.
Yeah. An absolute trooper. She crawled to her house along a ditch, then made the call, then went back to check on her neighbour. Yeah, crawled all the way back again. And then once her neighbour had sort of said, look, you should get inside and check where the emergency services are, she crawled back again. So she showed incredible, not just incredible bravery, but just absolutely amazing resilience and determination after a hip replacement.
Her neighbor Cole, unfortunately, that passed out and bled for his injuries. And then we got the first armed police officer to arrive to the scene, who was the Sergeant Stuart Guthrie, officer in charge of Paul Chalmers Police Station, non-commissioned officer in the Armed Offenders Squad, because officially policemen in New Zealand don't carry guns as a common feature of themselves. Well, in that time, in the 90s and nowadays. Stuart, who knew David personally, came armed with a Smith & Wesson Model 10 police revolver, and he enlisted to help of Constable Russell Anderson, who had arrived a short time earlier with the fire service. He armed himself with a rifle belonging to a resident, Constable Russell. With darkness approaching, because it was getting late, Guthrie tried to, approach to Gray's crib. Guthrie observed Gray and relayed his movements inside the house. They had been watching him for a while. They knew he was armed, obviously. Anderson spotted Gray coming out of the front of the property, tried to stop him. Gray
basically called him and issued the
order to
orders to cease and desist, to stop and put his weapons away. throw down his weapons.
Taking cover in the sand dunes of a neighboring creek, Guthrie encountered Davy Gray coming out of the darkness. Yelling at him, he fired a warning shot and Gray shouted, "Don't shoot," leading Guthrie to believe he was surrendered. And there's actually the record of the police call in which Stephen Guthrie calls out to David Gray and tells him, "Stop it, David, or I will shoot," showing that they knew each other. Unfortunately, Gray fired several times and one shot striking Stu Guthrie in the head, killing him instantly. Minutes later, the Dunedin branch of the AOS, Armed Offender Squad, began to arrive and seal off the township with a roadblock. Also units from the Armed Offenders unit from Christchurch, Imaro and Invercargill were called in support. And it was very it was a very dangerous situation because by this time they realized not only he had one gun, he had several guns, including a scooped rifle, which made David potentially accurate at long range.
I mean, aside from several 22s, 22 caliber rifles, which obviously still, lethal, are a lot less powerful than a lot of other guns. However, he did have a rifle that was particularly powerful, which was the weapon that he did have, which was quite
an AK-47
powerful.
type.
Yeah, it's a variant of the I wouldn't say imitation, but it's a Chinese derivation of the AK-47. So it was a military rifle, which potentially can be a submachine gun, but because of the gun laws in New Zealand, it was modified to be a semi-automatic only. However, that being said, the caliber of this weapon and the power is, military grade, so it's absolutely terrifyingly lethal, and that was scoped. So to have the potential of David Gray looking down the scopes at the Armed Defenders Squad would have been absolutely terrifying, nerve-wracking.
Yeah, and I lost a little detail which very significant. In between, he shot Garry Holden and shot the children and then started the spree, properly speaking. David had went back inside his crib and applied some
camo paint. Yeah. So he, by that stage had gone
full on Rambo mode, if you wish.
Yep.
Except that John Rambo didn't kill children or civilians. At least.
No, in fact, I don't think he technically killed anyone in that movie, but that's an aside.
Well, there is actually proof that he had been using targets for a while and making disturbing drawings of people being murdered and shot. Yet, hard to say whether this was... I wouldn't say that this spree was planned, but the fantasies of revenge and retaliation had been harvesting in his mind for a while.
Yeah.
Commissioner of Police John Jamieson authorized the Anti-Terrorist Squad, the Specialist Counter-Terrorist Unit, to travel to Dunedin and locate Gray. And group members were in Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland, who had to take a morning business flight because they couldn't get the Air Force to transport them, which seems a bit odd. Maybe a country that is unprepared for this. For that. Or
there may have been certain legal issues with armed forces giving police use of their vehicles.
As you imagine why the residents were fleeing Aramoana as fast as possible, then a large number of reporters met the flight on arrival at Dunedin, also with some of the special terrorist squad. The anti-terrorist squad members took a reconnaissance flight over the township in an Iroquois helicopter. The helicopter initially flew high as it had no armor for small arms fire. Look at that, I didn't know that. And Gray had shot at a private news helicopter earlier that morning.
In this case, it was the crew of the Air Force who were in the Iroquois helicopter, which it was carrying armed police, and they were doing a reconnaissance, flying over areas that they believed Gray might be in, essentially narrowing down the field, and they were dropping tear gas grenades as they went along in the hope that it would flush him out if he was hiding in certain areas. Yep, they did this for over 8 hours, and
they had the order to shoot to kill if he had a firearm. In the meantime, Gray had entered a small crib, a different crib in Aramoana, had eaten a meal, and actually had gone to sleep for the night. Some Christchurch members of the anti-terrorist squad moved into Aramoana at about 6 a.m. of 14th of November. The ATS went first to Gray's house, passing the bodies on the ground. And after clearing neighbor houses, they put a stun grenade into Gray's crib, blowing out the windows, followed by tear gas.
I mean, from there they basically did a fairly systematic. From there they did a fairly systematic clearing of the the neighbours' houses and the subsequent houses. Just clearing the street as they went along until they made their way.
They also found Mrs. Dickinson hiding. Who had been hiding for
a long time,
good 20 hours, terrified. And after almost a full day of checking out the crib, this was less than 24 hours, it was 22 hours. The ATS checked a crib with a broken window on the northeastern side of the crib. Had large hedges on both sides, and the group spotted Gray briefly at a window, and a shooting battle ensued. Police put a stun grenade through a window, but it bounced off a mattress that Gray had placed as a barricade and landed near the police. Unfortunate. Afterwards, the police fired tear gas into the crib, and Gray began shooting not at the police but through the shed, precisely.
Yep.
It was just
shooting indiscriminately because he was choking and was blinded.
Yeah, and also he never had a good eyesight in the first place.
That's true. But if he's just shooting through the wall, I think it's he realizes it's sort of a last stand.
In the meantime, the Air Force Iroquois, the helicopter, was also flying above the crib to ensure that Gray wouldn't escape.
Or if he did escape, they'd be able to track him hopefully fairly easily. So that definitely he was penned in. And
around 5:50 p.m., David Gray ran out of the house. He had washed off his camo painting from his face. And while shooting from the hip and shouting, "Kill me, fucking kill me, you bastards," to the police and the ATS. He took several steps before being hit and knocked up by the ATS gunfire. He was shot 5 times, in the eye, neck, chest, and twice in the groin. He was put on a plastic handcuff, and he struggled fiercely against the police, and he actually had to be recuffed twice, while berating the police for not having killed him. Ambulance officers treated him and the scene on the way to the Dunedin hospital by providing him oxygen. But at 6:10 p.m., David Gray died from his wounds on the way to the hospital. Once the perpetrator was put down, the police got a proper search, and we finally get to know what was the
arsenal of weapons.
He had. What did he have?
Well, he had his .22 caliber Winchester rifle fitted with a suppressor. He had the Norinco SKS semi-automatic rifle, which is the AK-47 derivative. He had a .22 caliber Squires and Bingham Model 16. He had a .22 caliber Squires and Bingham Model 16. He had a Squires and Bingham Model 16, which is similar in appearance to a M16, like the American military assault rifles. He also had an air rifle. He had hundreds of rounds of .22 ammunition and approximately 100 rounds of .223 ammunition, which is, a fairly large arsenal for a man living alone in a holiday shack.
It's kind of a mystery where he was hiding these guns, because he had been searched for the Peeping Tom incident and for the argument he had with the assistant of Galaxy Books. But these guns were never found, and no one ever saw him really using the guns or trying shooting. Seems like there is a very hidden space in the Aramoana beach. It's a very isolated point which an acquaintance showed him once, and appears to be the place where he was practicing his shooting. He also had dark
target
figures.
outlines. Yep.
What else was found in his house was this peculiar
Artwork that he had
made, or that he called peace. But what do we see?
We see
Would you like to describe it to the listeners?
We see a profile of half of Hitler's face covered by a banner of a swastika.
A big
swastika. And then
on the left side, and on the right side we have
several guns being held by police officers or Nazi stormtroopers with graves, standing over graves of unmarked soldiers. And then to the right
I would say a demonstration of peace-loving people.
Being held back by the stormtroopers.
And a giant hand making the very well-known peace sign. And on the inferior left side of the picture, there is a human-like picture that has a halo on its head, and it's in a position with the arms spread open, sort of a crucified-like. And on the documentary we were watching, which is one of the resources that I'm going to let for anybody that is interested. It says that this is how David Gray sees himself. I don't know where they got that interpretation, because I didn't read it in the book, but it could be. And if that's the way he saw himself, as a crucified...
a martyr.
A martyr.
Which, again, is not uncommon amongst extremists and not necessarily definitely lone wolf, domestic terrorists, as they say, but definitely a common sort of self opinion that a lot of
themselves.
That a lot of extremists hold, that they're on some sort of holy, righteous, crusade or quest. They're willing to lay down their lives for their ideals, and that somehow elevates them and justifies the horrible things that they might have to do.
3 days after Aramoana massacre happened, the residents of the township decided to, in a symbolic act of cleansing, to do what?
To torch David Gray's house.
The house of the Norse god of war.
So, the townsfolk of Aramoana gathered together and threw a match into the house and collectively watched the house of the person who had absolutely decimated the community burn to the ground.
You know that 2 days before the massacre, Garry Holden had a chat with David Gray, and David confessed that he was thinking about taking his own life. And Garry, being a counselor, he talked him out of committing suicide at that moment. We ended up with, David committing what is called...
Also by police. He wanted to go down, in his own mind, as a martyr, die in the blaze of glory. Well, we'll leave it there. Another heavy topic, but nonetheless, a key piece of New Zealand's history. Out of respect for the people who died at Aramoana, I'll read the names of the people who passed there. Rewa Ariki Bryson, aged 11. Simon Christopher Cole, aged 62. Victor James Crimp, aged 71. James Alexander Dixon, aged 45. Sergeant Stuart Graham Guthrie, aged 41. Garry John Holden, aged 38. Jasmine Amber Holden, 11. Magnus Jameson, aged 69. Ross Jeremy Percy, aged 42. Vanessa Grace Percy, aged 26. Dion Raymond Jack Percy, 6. Aleki Tali, aged 41. Leo Wilson, aged 6. Once again, you can find us on our social pages, which are
Instagram at History of Evil Men, Twitter, Facebook. We also have a Facebook group in which I will upload all our sources, and we have a Patreon account as well if you want to spare $1, which is patreon.com/A History of Evil Men. You can listen to us in most streaming services, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. As always, we'll leave you with the wondrous sounds of Steph Animal. Thank you to her for providing the music for our intro and outro. And once again, thank you all for listening.